Hello, my name is Kevin Humeniuk, and this is my Slidecast for Humanities 1QU3. What is rock and roll? You see, rock and roll isn't a career or hobby, it's a life force. It's something very essential. Rock and roll is a musical genre that originated in the United States within the 1940s and 1950s. Rock and roll has had an effective outcome on society in the past and still does today. From genres such as blues and jazz all the way to classical rock, the genre of rock and roll has had a huge impact in its time period and on the time period as a whole. As a main focus, rock and roll did not just originate out of nowhere. The evolution and progression of rock and roll's timeline significantly outlines the details as to where exactly rock and roll came from, how it all began, and essentially its overall impact on society. Another perspective to be taken focuses directly towards the meaning and message behind the lyrics, as well as iconic and influential individuals that set a name for rock and roll, such as Elvis Presley and/or the Beatles. Lastly, another direction to be taken focuses on the overall impact on society and the community as to which people live in. Rock and roll is significantly remembered from its iconic artists to its famous albums and songs that in effect led to outstanding breakthroughs in people's lifestyles, fashion, and attitudes. As stated, rock and roll was not just seen as a typical genre of music, but rather a lifestyle. Ultimately, rock and roll has acted as a stepping stone for generations to come and essentially has led to the development of future genres today. Rock and roll has had some of the greatest outbreaks of all time throughout its evolution, means behind the message of lyrics, its impact on society and the community. However, how has the progression and evolution of rock and roll affected society as a whole? Just like every genre of music, there needs to be a starting point as to where the progression and evolution of such genres take off. As for rock and roll, it had forever changed America and the world through various artists such as Elvis Presley and the Beatles. The king of pop, also known as Elvis Presley, institutionalized what is now known as rock and roll. Through Elvis Presley's signature dance moves to his exquisite vocals, Elvis brought together and ended the segregation between blacks and whites and created an image and name for himself. The achievements and accomplishments Elvis received as a recording artist were phenomenal and outstanding. For example, Elvis holds the most certifications of gold, platinum, and multi-platinum out of any artist in recorded history. In addition, he has sold more than 1 billion records, occupying 40% of that outside the United States. During the time period of the 1950s, though rock and roll was conceived as vulgar and a bad influence within the generation, through Elvis's music did he change that. Elvis wanted the mainstream culture to be free and embrace what is true rock and roll. All Elvis wanted to do was write, create, and perform music that would essentially provoke and engage society into what is known as rock and roll. Another iconic and remarkable artist that institutionalized the rock and roll culture was the Beatles. The Beatles in return revolutionized youth culture with their affectionate harmonies, structures, and sounds apparent in every and all of their own written songs. The iconic images of Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, George Harrison, and John Lennon brought forth the focal point of succession in pop culture, but significantly attributed to the rock and roll scene. With their historic and recognizable appearances and their music, the Beatles became a huge sensation within the 1960s. Such songs as Hey Jude and Revolution topped the charts and sold roughly over 6 million copies, becoming two of their most powerful and popular singles ever created. The Beatles' songs focused and ranged from a variety of different directions, focusing primarily on love songs and progressively shifting towards their diverse extravaganzas. Through many of their biggest hits, Let It Be, Come Together, or A Day in the Life, one of their most famous songs to date, Hey Jude, has substantially revolutionized rock and roll and set the standards for the evolution and progression of the genre that holds such great significance. Furthermore, the progression of rock and roll through such artists as Elvis Presley and the Beatles have dealt a significant amount of succession towards the genre and its evolution. Though rock and roll originated and drew from many different genres of music, it essentially created and made a name for itself that in hand stood as something else with regards to people in society. Musicians of the rock and roll scene not only stayed within the lines, but took into their own precautious measures elaborate ways to enhance the music genre and make it something of their own. Rock and roll will forever live on and will always prosper, with oncoming artists putting forth new and unique interpretations of music unheard of. Not only has the evolution of rock and roll had an impact on people in society, but also the lyrics and the medium behind the message as well has had central importance with respect to rock and roll. Lyrics are not just words spoken, but are rather heartfelt and deep thoughts that have a specific meaning and/or backstory to what is being sung. According to the designated time period of the 1950s, rock and roll songs typically convey abstract lyrics that essentially do not follow a specific outline but rather deal with a complex storyline. Within the 1950s, a man by the name of Little Richard was seen as a controversial figure in rock and roll music due to his absurd and inappropriate use of sexual remarks within his lyrics. As stated before, lyrics are not just words spoken, but have a specific meaning and message behind them. As timeline progresses, new and differentiating subject matters arise and are the central focal point of that time period. Not only did rock and roll focus essentially on topics related to sex, violence, and substance abuse, but also focused and dealt with categories of other subjects. A variety of different themes took place and were not all directed towards bad motives. For example, with regards to the Beatles and their song Let It Be, it was written by Paul McCartney himself and was devoted to his mother named Mary, who unfortunately passed away. As for certain individuals, not all people pay attention or focus primarily on the lyrics within the song. However, they listen to the music because they enjoy the artist and/or just like the sound of the beat. Lyrics hold significant value within a song, from being as simple and straightforward to in-depth, which requires interpretation from the listener to acquire what exactly the vocalist is singing about. The medium behind the message with regards to lyrics holds both central importance with respect to rock and roll in the sense that the subject matter and what is being discussed correlate with one another and essentially intertwine. Furthermore, rock and roll has had a significant impact on people, which as a result have aroused various problems and troubles within people's lives and society. With regards to the youths in the designated time period, adults had ultimate authority and control over the youths and say what they can and cannot do. When the emergence of rock and roll began, it was an outlet and sign for youths to follow the so-called wrong path and in a sense rebel against adult authority. Artists such as Elvis Presley, Little Richard, and the Beatles were of immense influence upon youths and their attitude in society as to how they act and perceive the notion of what it is like to be a rock star. Elvis Presley, aka the King of Pop, with famous songs such as Hound Dog or Jailhouse Rock, was considered one of the most inspirational and influential rock stars within rock and roll. Essentially, rock and roll was a form of gratification and serenity for teens within the 1950s. While adults despised rock and roll music, teens felt as if it was a way for them to express themselves in their lives and actually feel as if they are important and have a voice in society. During the rock and roll era, teens became affiliated with what went on and what became popular within rock and roll music, resulting in teens acting out and imitating their favorite rock stars in how they lived, dressed, and appeared. Essentially, rock and roll music had its ups and downs when it comes to its impact on society through both positive and negative outcomes. It allowed for teens to find an escape route in one way or another, as well as served and stopped most racial problems apparent during the time by creating unity among both black and white. Regardless of the impact, rock and roll served as a starting point for future music generations and has held utmost significance with the impact it has made on musical genres to date. Finally, rock and roll has had some of the greatest outbreaks of all time throughout its evolution, means behind the message of lyrics, and its impact on society and the community. Rock and roll would never have began if it were not for the development of present genres as to which rock and roll adapted from. Artists such as Elvis Presley and the Beatles, in effect, led and carved the path for following musicians to follow in their footsteps. The means behind the message of the lyrics were the central core of a musical work, because without the use of lyrics to express how and what the artist was feeling, the audience would be unable to relate to what is being said. And lastly, the impact on society and the community in due time led to significant changes within rock and roll. Rock and roll was held liable for shifting the perspectives of young teens, as well as focused and dealt with solving troublesome problems and setting the stage for future genres and our artists today. Whether or not if they have passed, broken up, or are still together, their music is still heard around the world. As one can see with their own eyes, rock and roll will forever live on. And just as my friend from the Beatles, Paul McCartney, sang, "Let it be." Let it be.